Hey there, it's David, the ADHD LGPC, and today we are talking about what to expect from an exposure in therapy sessions, brought to you by A Fear of Exposures. So, what we're doing today is just going to walk through what it would look like were you to go into a session and do an exposure in order to hopefully make it less overwhelming or anxiety provoking. And so, an exposure, we already talked about that it is a chance for you to experience fear in a safe way in order to be able to decrease that anxiety over time. So, what to actually expect when you go into a therapy office though? We're not just going to throw you out there and be like, hey, you have a fear of snakes? Here, hold one. That's not at all what it's going to be like. When you go in and have an exposure, first things first, you're going to talk about it with your therapist. We are very strict on that. We talk about it and walk through every step of what to expect. But even before that, we make a list of what it is that you fear and what would be a 1 on that fear for a 10. So to use snakes example still, we'll say if a fear of 1 was thinking about a snake and a fear of 10 would be, your anxiety 10 is holding the snake and having it like rest on your neck, if that was a 10. We'd be like, okay, we're going to pick something between a 6 and a 7. Ideally, that's where exposure is best, because when we use something that's a 6 or 7, so let's see, being in the same room as a snake, well then, over time, that 6 or 7 will decrease, hopefully to a 4 or 5, or just a 4, at which point what used to be a 10 now might be a 9. And so the first thing we do is we make that hierarchy of fears. What is it that you are most distressed about and least distressed about? And then most of the time we'll do an exposure in session, and we will let you know ahead of time that, hey, next session when you come in, we are going to do an exposure. Here's what it will look like, so you're well prepared. And then when you come in, you'll execute the exposure, you'll do it, and you'll have time to debrief afterwards and talk about it before. So you'll most likely come in, your therapist will talk to you and say, hey, so we're doing this today. Are you prepared for it today? What are your possible fears? And you'll go over them. Then the exposure will happen. And afterwards, you'll debrief and say, okay, here's what we feared, like here's what the worst part of it was. And we'll ask questions such as, hey, at what point was your distress the worst? And how would you rank that? And how would you rank your distress at the end of the exposure? Ideally, we're looking for it to either remain the same or go down, hopefully, but it might take multiple sessions. And so please do not be hard on yourself if after one session you still are just as scared of snakes. These are long-term measures. And so what we will do is do an exposure in session. Then we might ask you to do one at home if it's something you can do. So let's say it's a social phobia you have, and it's specifically that introducing yourself to new people. Well, we might rehearse it and do a imaginal exposure, as we call it. An imaginal exposure is when we really imagine it. We might write a script and say, what would it be like to meet that new person? To introduce yourself to someone you don't know? What would you say? What is the worst case scenario of what they could do? And we'll talk it through. And then we'll role play it in the office. And then you might, if you feel ready, we will have you go home and then engage sometime between this session and next session, have you introduce yourself to a new person. And if it works, great, we'll talk about it. If it doesn't work, that's not the worst thing, because then when you come back, we'll ask, did you do the exposure? And if you say yes, okay. If you did not, we tend to then look at, okay, what were the obstacles? What were the barriers of entry to this exposure? What made it so hard to do? And we'll look at tackling those, because it could be other issues as well. And so really with exposure, we're never just going to drop you in on a situation, be like, hey, guess what? Surprise, today you're doing an exposure of your worst fear. No. We're going to build up to it. We're going to work our way up to it. We're not going to pick a 10 or a 9 on what's super scary to you. Instead, we'll pick something a little lower. And we'll work our way through it. We'll work our way up until you're ready. And the thing is, this is done at your pace. We're never going to force an exposure on you. And so really, it is a great opportunity. When you have an opportunity to exposure, it's a great opportunity for long-term growth, a long-term change in anxiety. But to overview, you'll come in, you'll make a hierarchy of fears, you'll do exposures in session until you feel ready, then you'll do them at home, and then you'll check back. And we'll do that again and again until the anxiety is decreased. And then we might move on to a new thing that requires an exposure. But anyway, so that's exposures and what to expect from them. I hope you have a wonderful day.